First of all, welcome. I was looking at your CV, and obviously you're a professor of practice at Lancaster, which I want to know what this professor of practice means, because I feel like we want to talk about what you're practicing at the moment. But also, I was thinking about, we've had some brilliant authors here, but you more than anyone, I think, has seen this issue from lots of sides as a European Parliament advisor, Green Alliance, Vice Chair of the Sustainable Development Commission, and setting up this climate leadership program for MPs, and really being at that front line of what happens to, how is policy made, how does suggestions from experts and scientists and us lot, I want to say, looking around the table, how does that land with MPs? So I'm really hoping to hear some kind of anecdotes and thoughts on what you've seen and what you've heard, as well as talk about your book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And I've done my usual of sort of, so the problem is I then go back to it and there are so many questions. So I have a load of questions, and we'll start with some of those before we'll let everybody pile in. The first thing I always do, just in case, and just as you were coming in, I did a little poll to see how many people had a chance to read the book. And quite a good proportion, I think, but maybe you could just give us the core tenets. What's your core message of this book and why you wrote it? And then we can start from there and unfold.
Sure. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much. I mean, such an absolute pleasure for me to come and chat about what what is an absolute sort of driving force of what I do with like-minded people. So thank you so much for the invitation. I mean, why did I write the book? I think the book for me is sort of both professional and personal. It was. So in terms of my research, let me do the research bit first and then the personal bit. In terms of my research, I really wanted to dive into this question about how we steer the climate action we need through a democracy, because it seemed to me that people don't talk about that. So you have a few very brave souls like James Lovelock, the earth scientist, who said, climate change is such a big problem that we may need to put democracy on hold for a while. He was very explicit about that, but actually what most people do is sort of almost ignore the democratic system. People are very keen to put forward their prescriptions for what must happen to tackle climate change, but there's very little attention and very little research goes into how you steer those changes through the democratic system. And the more I looked at this, the more I realized that James Lovelock was, although, an inspirational person in many ways, was fundamentally wrong about this, that to solve the climate crisis, we actually need more democracy, not less. We need to be reaching out to people to talk to them about what matters in their lives and how that connects to the climate crisis. We need to be making our democracies work better so that we can make good collective decisions about what is fundamentally a collective action problem. So I wanted to explore that democracy question a bit. And in fact, that is now front and centre of my professional work at Lancaster. I lead a research team looking at how to make democracy work better for climate change. But then there was the whole personal dimension as well. And as you said in your introduction, I've been involved in this now for many years and in many ways. So I worked for politicians originally. I trained politicians. I worked as a government advisor. I've done some work which is more sort of campaigning focused, but not so much. And it was I found it really interesting to draw together all those strands of my career, connect it to the sort of personal bit about, what I think about the world, what my hopes and fears are for the next, 10, 20, 30 years, however much longer I've got left on this planet. Think about it in terms of my family and community. So all that went into the book. And I have to say that on the first bit, on the professional stuff, I was, pretty sure of my ground. I knew that stuff, and it was straightforward to write it down. On the personal stuff and relating it to my career to date, I sort of didn't know how that story should be told. And it's that classic thing about when you're very close to something, you assume that everyone knows that. And in fact, the feedback that I've really enjoyed from the book is people saying that they liked that sort of ringside seat, if you like, at the actual way that politics is done and decisions get made in government. And to me, that's sort of the bread and butter of what I've done for many years, and so it felt a bit weird to write it down. But actually, since the book came out in the first week of lockdown, terrible timing. Since the book came out, I've actually been really heartened by people's reactions to that. That bit, the kind of almost the witnessing, if that doesn't sound too pretentious, the witnessing that I've done over the past 20 years or more.
Yeah, no, and you could hear that's some of what I'm hoping you're going to give us some snippets of today as well, because I think not many of us see that actually, and get that close to how this actually happens. A lot of reports, I'm looking at all these faces, and lots of them I know, who people have done lots of research and reports and work in business or in NGOs, and yet, yeah, how does it land, all that work we're doing? Is that cups of tea?
It's a very kind son with a lovely cup of tea.
And what did your son think of the book? That's very sweet.
I don't think he's read it.
Sensible. How old is he?
Have you read my book, Jessie? No. He's 15 and his brother's 17. That's maybe a conversation for further down the line. I try not to force feed them.
Yeah.
So as a result, they don't really. They do think about climate, but they're not that. It's not centre of their lives at all.
We'll come back to that. I have a little cluster of thoughts. The book provoked in me on that. So brilliant, thank you. And really a lot of sort of, if I was going to sort of find one or a couple of fundamental strands, is that thing about we need more democratic solutions. It is possible, and actually there's something in that social contract and participatory piece that I want to dig into it. But the first thing, sort of, I think my first note said something like, is it just that in general there is a basic assumption about human nature at the sort of foundation of this system, which is flawed, which is about humans being fundamentally selfish and negative, and that's kind of why we've ended here and why we're struggling to solve it. Left of field question, apologies to start you off there.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? One thing I hear a lot is that people won't, make sacrifices for climate action. That, you're seeing it played out now with, whether or not people are prepared to pay for, home insulation or renewables or whatever that might be, and this feeling that this feeling that the assumption that we are sort of fundamentally short-sighted and possibly selfish. I mean, the academic evidence is mixed on that. The actual sort of, humans, this is, I'm not a psychologist, but from what I've read of psychology, we're very collective in our outlook, and so whether or not we're selfish probably depends on what other people around us are doing and what expectations are put upon us. And that's, that takes us straight away into democracy, because democracy is about collective decision making. Essentially, if you see, if we decide collectively to do something, if we decide collectively to override our individual selfishness, then actually it becomes the normal and the natural thing to do to join in with that. But I mean, I tend to think of it the other way around. I mean, I tend to think, like, seriously, would anyone vote for 3 degrees of warming as opposed to 1.5? Like, honestly, if you have the information and the ability to influence, why would you choose a climate a future of climate crisis. And all my experience of working with citizens in citizens panels and the climate assembly and so on, they've all confirmed that view, that people, you know, get how serious it is. They absolutely get that we need to do something about this. And of course, they're not going to do things which are really problematic and make them a lot poorer in the short term, but they're willing to have that conversation about what we do collectively.
Yeah, no, and that's because I found the book quite optimistic, and which suits my personality brilliantly. But you know, exactly that actually people are quite happy with more ambitious targets and that. So yeah, it just sort of something. Oh, and actually, Sophie has. Do you want to give your own question, Sophie, or shall I say it? Just that she's recently listened to a podcast that says that 80% of people agree this is urgent, but it just seems that otherwise, because the media focuses on the 19 MPs who are trying to fight net zero.
Yeah, so whichever way, I mean, I've actually just written a summary of public opinion research on this. Whether you take surveys and polls, whether you look at more qualitative, deliberative work where you can actually, you know, talk to people about their reasoning and thinking, people are really worried about climate change, and they're very supportive of action. Where there is a bit of not necessarily a wobble, but where it's not so clear is in support for measures to reduce emissions. So things like home energy efficiency and renewables are very popular, nuclear a lot less so. There's a lot of angst about restricting flying and restricting meat consumption. So, you know, that doesn't mean that we couldn't have policies for things like flying, you know, restricting flying and having low carbon diets, but you have to go about those things really carefully. Which again, you know, the best way to do that is to talk to people about, you know, this is the task, this is what we've got to do. How can we do that? You know, what would you be willing to do if others did X and Y?
Yeah, I can see actually. I will jump to. There's a question in the chat, which is from Donna, that she says, "I'm just really puzzled to see how quickly the holiday sector has returned, and the way people are returning to air travel, as though nobody understands the connection to climate change. Don't know what the data is showing, but I can't foresee systemic change in the travel agency to reach the emissions we need." So it just, yeah, and I think that just underscores exactly what you said, that something has to happen on the flights, surely, but we have to figure out how do we do that in a just way, I guess.
Yeah, and also we have to think about who has a voice in this debate. So, you know, the readout from Climate Assembly UK, who did consider emissions from aviation, and Climate Assembly UK was 108 people who were chosen to represent the UK population as a whole. So it was absolutely representative demographic. And they were given a number of scenarios about air travel, including ones which were basically the industry growth forecast, you know, huge growth in aviation, all the way down to significant restrictions. And they went for a sort of mid-range. They basically said stabilize or increase a bit. So they weren't like really gung-ho about stopping flying, but they were open to discussing things like the frequent flyer levy, where basically the more you fly, the more tax you pay. And they actually amended that to be frequent and further. So, you know, the further you go and the more flights you take, the more you should pay in the form of tax. So they were open to that. But also it's worth thinking about who has influence in these debates, because actually in the debate about air travel, it's not necessarily individuals. And, you know, it's worth remembering that most people in the world haven't got on a plane, and a significant proportion of the UK population who are big flyers don't fly. Yeah. Because they can't afford to. The people who are being listened to in the debate around aviation are the airlines. and this is the problem, the high carbon sectors, airlines, the oil and gas sector, the car makers and so on, they have a disproportionate influence in government. They second people, they pay for research, they sponsor all party groups, all that kind of thing, and so they're actually distorting our democracy on that. So I think that you could, even on something like aviation, if you had a good process, you could actually come to some a decent position on it, which wouldn't be, wouldn't maybe be as radical as some campaigners want, but it would definitely take us in the right direction.
Yeah, I saw some stats not that long ago from the US of how, even though the car industry have all signed, basically put their business strategies towards electric cars solely within quite a short period of time, they managed with their lobbying, almost not quite single-handedly, but to turn over the Build Back Better bill in the US on and really go fossil fuel rather than EVs. So that lobbying and that disconnect, because and maybe we won't take it right now because I can see lots of interesting questions piling in already, but that how we sort of define, you have quite a lot on, some on interest groups versus lobbyists versus how companies can be advocates for positive change and sort of and rules. And I want to come back to that, but I just want to I'm just looking at the questions quickly. No, we'll wait for that for a little bit, and then I just want to cover a few bits, and I want to come back to some of these points. You said it quite early about Lovelock and sort of let's suspend democracy, and I'm really interested in that, and also the Stockholm Resilience Institute and those planetary boundaries work, that it kind of assumes a benign global authority of some kind, and yet to my mind we've seen over the recent years sort of those pan-national bodies really not do that well. Where we are now, that actually Facebook and Google and some big companies have more influence than some of those larger bodies. Are they just spent, and do we need to retire them and come up with something different, maybe more localized?
Well, we've never, over the past, 150 years, we've arguably ever managed to do politics at anything other than the nation state level. I mean, ironically, the European Union is a sort of experiment in creating a properly linked group of nation states who agree to be bound by sort of collective rules. But the UN tried really hard, didn't it? And it's worth remembering that the UN is still, through the UNFCCC, still the body that actually holds the ring on climate negotiations and tries to bring nation states to the table. I think there's a bit of an issue here so with the planetary boundaries, I have huge respect for Johan Rockström and others who put that who put that view forward, and Rockström's ability to put all the problems of the world and literally all the problems of the planet onto one PowerPoint slide about planetary boundaries, and scare the living daylights out of boardrooms and politicians and whoever else with that slide. That is an incredible skill. I think that skill of simplification and synthesis doesn't work for governance because it implies a sort of very sort of methodical, bloodless ceding of power from the nation state to some kind of international authority, which isn't the UN, because the UN isn't working, but they're not quite clear about that. And so it's very it's very far removed from the the messy and difficult way that actually we govern ourselves through politics. And there's so many practical questions about, how actually do you do that? How do you set up some kind of world planetary governance thing? But there are also genuinely moral questions about, obviously we have to bring emissions down, but there are lots of different ways of doing that, and they all affect people's lives, and we absolutely need to involve people in those decisions. And if we try for sort of, technocratic men in suits making decisions on behalf of them all, it ain't going to work. So I think there are both moral and practical problems with that kind of thing. It's a slightly separate issue, and I don't know if you want me to go into it with sort of nation states that are dictatorships. The how does China do question, and the evidence is that autocracies do worse than democracies on climate, but there's probably a lot of other reasons for that. They tend, it's very hard to say for certain. And I hope that autocratic states can also find a way through the climate crisis. They really have to. But for those of us who are lucky enough to live in a democracy of sorts, suggesting that we abandon that in the hope of getting better climate outcomes is an absolute non-starter as far as I'm concerned.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, we'll leave the other countries for now and see if anybody brings them up in the chat. We can come back to that. The two questions popped to my mind. So one, I want to hear, you were quite categorical. You were like, that ain't going to work. Can you give us an example or sort of what you have seen that makes you say that, I guess? I want to push on that a little bit. Are people not just happy to be told the solution?
So do you mean between countries or within countries?
No, for example, well, it could be either, that technocratic men in suits make decisions and push them down.
So between countries, in terms of the UN system, we have very firm evidence that doesn't work. The collapse of Copenhagen, because international negotiations until Copenhagen were basically done by top-down, what they called burden sharing. I mean, dodgy words, but anyway, where they would get together at these big summits and decide which countries should, cut their emissions by how much. And that system fell apart because countries were not prepared to be told by other countries or by UN bodies what to do. And that's how the Paris system came about, where it's bottom up. That's the whole approach. Every country comes along and says, okay, this is what I'm going to contribute, and then in theory those are all added up, and you see whether that is enough, and it isn't, so they go back and that's the process we're involved in right now. And it's too slow, it's not what we need, but it is a process of agreement. So I think in terms of between countries, I think that is, that Copenhagen is living proof that those top-down systems don't work. At national level, I think it works to set the Climate Change Act is a brilliant way of setting targets and the overall framework for carbon reduction. But in terms of how those come about, it's very, very difficult to manage centrally, for Westminster, for Whitehall civil servants to manage it centrally. And I've just finished some research interviewing a whole load of civil servants about climate strategy, and it's a really overwhelming finding that they think there should be more localized approaches, because if you manage a local area, where your big emitters are, what the opportunities are, what your population wants, you can get people on side for the changes involved. And conversely, if it's quite a sort of top-down national strategy, it's just going to wind up local areas. I mean, I've seen that in Cumbria with the proposed coal mine, that all local politicians, Labour and Conservative and Lib Dem, have all supported this coal mine, even though it's against their national party positions, because they feel like it's being imposed on them, and they don't get support from local people for following the national party line. Wow.
And do you think what would have made them switch, I guess? Could they have been convinced, had they been given the choices themselves? Do you think that would have come out differently? I'm still shocked that they would like the coal mine.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, on climate, what needs to happen at the national level is an unwavering commitment to the goal, to the targets, right? An unwavering commitment to, I mean, the targets as set out in the Climate Change Act. I mean, we can argue about whether that's enough, but, we've got statutory targets. We need absolute confident commitment to those. But then there could be a lot more leeway for local areas to set their own, to have responsibility for meeting those targets, but to meet them in their own way. So that then you wouldn't be proposing coal mines in Cumbria, you'd be proposing, steel recycling facilities instead of coal to feed into virgin steel production. You would be actively looking for things which could improve your economy and bring those emissions down. But I feel for local authorities because they don't have those powers, they don't have the budgets, they don't have tax raising powers. And actually there'll be people on this call who know more about the US than me, but as a sort of watcher from afar, I really notice how US states have been real innovators on climate policy, things like Texas of all places, and wind power, that kind of thing. California with its emissions, vehicle emissions mandates and so on, they actually managed to be real innovators and testers of good climate policy, even when at the federal level things are pretty dire.
No, funnily enough, yeah, there's I will read a couple of the comments on this one. Being cynical, don't you think votes have an influence on the coal mine issue, especially considering situations like the Red Wall constituencies? And then that's from Rhiannon Jane. So votes on that issue. And then NE, who I don't know your name, NE, but in North America, we've got 2 petrol states, Canada and Mexico, and de facto petrol states in the US. And the strength of fossil fuel and deregulatory interest is very strong, preventing the sweeping climate action. So comment rather than a message. I'm just checking when. And Will Peduto from Pennsylvania, Paul is pointing him out, the mayor, where he's really pushed the just transition in Pennsylvania. And there's this mix, I guess, on local, global all the time. And I just want to touch on a couple of other themes, and then we'll come back and pick lots of these up in terms of this idea of experts with the global view and people who have their local everyday views, and then politicians somewhere in between. And it seems that those actors, there's a dance going on there. And what we've seen a lot covered over the last couple of years, I guess, especially with the pandemic, it's like, oh, people don't believe in experts anymore. Let's have a balanced radio program, at least here in the UK, of let's have a climate change professor or an immunology professor, and then let's have a person who doesn't believe in what he's heard on Facebook or whatever. And those debates seem to become starker and starker. How do we get around that? Because of course we need experts, we need data, and you talk about it and make some references to that through the book. I'd just love to hear, are you feeling optimistic with that? Is that getting better? How do we fix it? Does it
I mean, I think the simple answer to that is you get the electorate you deserve. As a government, you get the electorate you deserve. What I see in things like the Climate Assembly and the local citizens' juries is when you go to people and you say we need to make decisions about climate change, it's actually really difficult. It's quite, it's a challenging issue. It's going to change your life, not necessarily make it worse, but it will change your life. we need to talk to people about how to best do that. Can you help us? And you give them the access to good information, you give them the chance to hear from others, to help shape their views, and you give them a real stake in the process. And you know what, they come up with really sensible answers. And all we're doing in something like the Climate Assembly is sort of artificially creating the ingredients of a really well-functioning democracy, because that is what should be happening in our democracy, right? People should have access to good information. We should we should be able to not be forced into extreme positions, but we should be able to have a decent debate. We should have we should be able to change minds and play with ideas. There's also a really hard dimension to this as well, because we should you shouldn't be able to have a louder voice if you have more money. It's all going on about participation and engagement sounds all kind of fluffy, but actually part of that is you cannot decide how much participation you have on the grounds of how much money you have. And that is what's happening in terms of high carbon lobbying. It's also kind of what's happening in terms of individual people, because, if you are, if your finances are precarious and you're working 2 jobs and so on, you haven't got time to somehow be a model climate citizen or start a community energy group or something. So the same's true, at the level of individual people as well. So in a way, anything like the Climate Assembly is just a sticking plaster. What we really need to do, and I appreciate this is a big task, is to try and make our democracies more more fit for purpose, so that those kinds of so that that's the way our democracies function.
Yeah, I should let you have a sip of your tea, because breathe.
Nearly through. It's very nice.
I'm aware that it's going to go. Don't want it to go cold. What I guess, and a couple of people are commenting on that through, because one thing that struck me when I got to the sort of back end of the book, which is how can you as a citizen take action, and there's a lot about talk to your MP, engage your MP in different things. And whilst I have spoken to my MP, but only because at the time he, I think, came to see my child at a tennis club or something like that, very, very non-specific. I wouldn't really have a clue how to, and I'm pretty sort of fairly well educated and engaged. But I just wonder what other ways is it? I think somebody said, "Oh, let's decide it all on Twitter with a smiley face," but that's cool. but do you see some obvious things we're just missing that are sort of between that, people being asked to join citizen assemblies or such like to that?
So, in terms of okay, well, very practically. Go and see it's really worth going to see your MP. There's a brilliant charity called Hope for the Future. I'll put their name in the chat, whose job is to support people talking to politicians, national politicians and local politicians, about climate change. It really makes a difference. So if you remember one thing from today, do that.
Everyone, UK at least.
In terms of in terms of what else we can do as individuals, I mean, we're always being pushed down the consumer focus, aren't we?
Yeah, we
like either really basic things like what you buy in the supermarket, or the bigger things like don't fly on holiday and so on, and that's really important. I mean, I try and do all those things. I sort of set myself slightly esoteric rules on what I am and aren't allowed to do, but I try and do all those things because I think it's really important to set an example. But there's so much you can do not as a consumer. So, literally talking to people, talking to friends and family, talking to people you meet through sports clubs, whatever that might be, you know, civic action, like, you know, joining community energy projects, that kind of thing. And actually, you know, an important part of a democracy is that we don't just talk to people who are like us. So, you know, any kind of outreach that you can do sort of beyond your normal social circle, especially if there's some climate thing attached to that, the you know, the better.
It's hard, right? It's I noticed your touchline comment whilst watching juniors football or something like that, and I was thinking, yeah, you know, I've got children and sporting and so on, but it's hard, and I feel like I'm pushing my agenda on everyone when I pick that up. So I wonder whether there's space for crib sheets, how to have nice climate conversations without shaming people, because I often find myself, at least, sort of tightrope of not wanting to make people feel awful versus kind of wanting them to look at themselves and get on with action.
Yeah, I mean, so there are crib sheets on how to talk to people about climate outreach. Do that. You can talk about it without. You can talk, not prescribe, can't you?
Yeah, no.
You know, are you worried about it? What do your kids think about it?
What do your children think?
You know, there's, and then, you know, focusing on the positive stuff. I mean, you know, I got an old and low range EV last year, but the number of conversations I've had with people in like weird circumstances, you know, car parks, and when the handyman came to do some work around the house, that kind of thing. And, you know, they're all climate conversations, aren't they? It's kind of normalizing some of the solutions. So yeah, I think I think curiosity is a really good weapon.
I think that's good. Well, and I agree with you. The consumer angle, that's the only thing that made me furious at COP, was a couple of companies, well, one in specific, that stood up and said they'd realized that their only carbon emissions problem was how consumers use their product, so they were going to just spend time educating consumers. Anyway, we will pass over that quickly. More general question on two things. One, do you think has social consensus shifted since you wrote the book over those, you know, as you said, it came out just the beginning of lockdown, and also for you, David Bent, our friend, has sort of said, did your position change on any aspect whilst through writing the book? Was there anything that surprised you?
What's shifted since I wrote it? Well, actually, things shifted a lot as I was writing it, because we had the IPCC 1.5 report and the school strikes, all the amazing stuff that Greta Thunberg and the other school strikers managed to achieve, a real rise in public concern. And I sort of frantically rewrote parts of it as a result. And I think, you know, I ended by saying this is, you know, the most exciting time, because I was actually, you know, if I think about where we were sort of 15 years ago, when getting it on the agenda was, you know, the main thing, and it was nowhere. And now we've almost gone too far to the other extreme, that everyone's really worried about it, but they're also sort of almost tipping into doomism, that it's too late to do anything about it, and harnessing that concern, but giving people the feeling that, you know, we can do this, that, you know, that's now the challenge. So I think things had shifted a lot then. I mean, I find it really hard to read where we are now. Those levels of concern aren't shifting. I worry that political attention is elsewhere. You know, in the UK, the combination of Brexit and COVID has been pretty lethal. But I think that, you know, the fact that it is such, that it remains such a concern, you know, is enough to keep it on the political agenda. In terms of David's question. Hi, Dave. We know each other. Has my position changed? I think the interesting thing for me was because the book was a bit of a sort of reflection of the work I'd done over 20 years. The thing that I thought through most was basically if I'd been too nice, if I hadn't been hard-edged enough, because I was director of Green Alliance, which is the sort of coziest sort of softly type of think tank, and I was doing that at a time when we didn't really have public support, and we'd sort of have to go cap in hand to politicians and say, please can you do this, it's really kind of be really nice if you could, and we didn't have that hard edge. And I think what shifted for me for writing the book was realizing that it's too late for softly, that you really need that hard edge. So I've spoken out a lot more. I found it quite exposing to do everything I did about the coal mine, for example, because it was, really straying into sort of campaigning territory. And I thought, well, is this gonna make me less credible in government? And then I thought, well, I can't think that anymore. I've just got to say it as it is. And so I think my position's shifted on that. I'm much less compromising than I was, or I compromised less than I did. Sorry, I should say.
Yeah, it makes sense. And there's something about that, and you explore a little bit, well, quite a lot on the sort of the stealth policies and the other ways that we're kind of action isn't really happening, but it looks like it's happening. The feel-good fallacy you mentioned as well. Could you just talk us a little bit through how you see those and how they might be replaced?
Yeah, so the feel-good fallacy is basically doing good stuff on climate, but keeping quiet about the bad stuff. So, it is from the most, absolutely blatant, oil company position of not considering scope 3 emissions, that is not considering the emissions from burning the oil or the coal that they dig out of the ground. I mean, and yet going on. I mean, in the case of the coal mine, they're installing charging points for their employees. I mean, fine, have charging points, but that ain't your climate impact, love. So those are your stealth strategies. I mean, we're all guilty of that. You focus on the positive things you can do, but it's sometimes quite hard to face up to the real big sources of your emissions. If for example, if you fly a lot, that will be the biggie. So I remember Mike Berners-Lee, who does the carbon numbers, and the best way to overcome this is to be absolutely upfront about the numbers, actually. So Mike Berners-Lee, who's a carbon footprinting expert who I work with, you should get him on your book club. It'd be great. He said he was once approached by someone who regularly flies across the Atlantic, and he was asked whether it's better to use tissues or the hand dryer in bathrooms. And you can look at that. You can look at that data, and hand towels are better, actually, he reckons. But it's kind of a misdirection of attention. But stealth strategies are quite different, because a stealth strategy is where governments do stuff on climate, but they don't bother talking to people about it because they don't think they'll have the support. And that's basically what we've done in the UK for so long, that we've actually been quite successful about in decarbonisation, essentially by stopping burning coal for power generation, and by getting more efficient vehicles and manufacturing and so on. But we haven't really made the case for that. We've just sort of done it, and we've missed a chance to build that conversation about acting on climate, and we've missed the chance to be proud of what we've done, but also to have that conversation about how that's not nearly enough and what the next stage might be.
So I'm going to pick up on, David had a follow-up question, which I think is actually perfect, because I want to talk a little bit about that hard edge, and I'm trying to find the question. It says, what does it mean, that campaigning position mean for you as an academic? I think somewhere in the book you say the more normal you look, the more politicians will listen to you if you go climate marching, which has been my kind of, I've gone with my children several times, and there is that bit. But as an academic, do we need all of you out on the streets? Will that convince the politicians, or are you better served talking to them quietly?
So yeah, it's brilliant, isn't it? I went on the climate march during the Glasgow summit with an organisation called Mothers Rise Up, who are just brilliant. It was basically, yes. Yeah. So it was, and yeah, it was basically like loads of families. I mean, predictably, I hadn't persuaded my teens, but I was there with my own mother actually, which was nice. And you know, it was just like a load of families marching through Glasgow, and you know, we didn't look like proper protesters, and that was sort of the whole point. I think what you can do as an academic is a really interesting one. So I mean, academic work is absolutely not about sort of, you know, you can absolutely be an academic and take a position. You know, it's kind of what it's about, really. That is the academic process, I think. But what I'm really careful to do is to make sure that what I say is firmly based on the evidence. So for the coal mine, for example, there were campaign groups, the local XR group, Friends of the Earth and so on, who were, you know, protesting at the site and outside the public inquiry and so on, and that's absolutely fine. I think, you know, that's a really important role to play, but mine was actually much more sort of amassing evidence from people who are experts in steel decarbonisation, from you know, climate scientists, and actually marshalling that evidence in order to make actually a very strong case that the mine shouldn't happen. But that case was entirely evidence-based. So, you know, we got Bob Watson to speak at the public inquiry, and he was just brilliant, you know, and that was, I mean, is that campaigning to do that? I don't know. I mean, you know, it was basically, I feel like my job now as an academic is to provide the very best evidence and to use it in the most effective way.
Yeah, no, that sounds brilliant. Spread it out, and just jumping back to the MPs. So you spent a lot of time with lots of them. Yeah, you don't get distracted by the chat. It's gone crazy. I'm seeing this. Sophie, thankfully, is pulling them out, the questions out, so I don't get too confused. But you spent a lot of time with MPs, and making a general assumption, because I know that people are calling in from all over the world, but the politicians are, you know, human beings, so they will be worried about climate change on one level. Yet, how are you finding, you know, are they changing? Do they see what they can do for this? Or how can we help them, apart from, I've booked in a call with my one soon. Apart from that, how can we help them kind of make the right choices and make the right decisions, do you think? Because I go with the assumption that most of them are in that to serve public good, really. And I'm sure the chat's now going to go wild telling me they're not, but they come from, if we assume they come from a decent place, most of them, then how do we get them acting faster, more dramatically, maybe taking stances like all of us should and do?
Yeah. So a part of that is giving them access to the right information and getting them to understand the science. That's part of it. That's where I started with the climate leadership program. We got new MPs, or even people before they were elected as MPs, we got them in a room and got them talking to climate scientists and businesses, people who are very active on climate solutions. And, you know, we called it climate leadership, but it was actually climate boot camp, really. It was, you know, this is if they came out of there thinking that climate was a material consideration for their job as a politician, that was job done as far as we were concerned. Yeah. But doing that work, and, you know, this is not a new observation, there's plenty of academic work from many disciplines, we know that, you know, just providing information doesn't change what people think or do. There's got to be more to it than that. And so when I did these very detailed interviews with MPs, the things that came to the fore were firstly a sort of you know, and people can, I mean, you know, feel free to at me in the chat for this, but a lot of them came across as quite vulnerable, actually, that, you know, they were struggling with a really difficult job. They were trying to forge a career for themselves within their party. They wanted to fit in, and that, you know, that identity question is really important. And they, you know, they wanted to be promoted. They wanted to get somewhere, and so with any issue, they'll be thinking, does this help me in that? And that's not because, you know, it might be in part because they sort of selfishly want to achieve stuff, and you know, they might want to do it for the ego. But actually, it's important that that climate is an issue that ambitious politicians can take up. If a politician starts shouting about climate change and that puts them on the fringes straight away, that's a problem, right?
Yeah,
if you want to, so I think we need to take that really seriously. So that means making sure that people speaking up for climate are people that those politicians sort of respect and listen to. The business community is really, really important there, but also, you know, social activists, you know, religious leaders, you know, if there's a kind of really strong core, and I think we've seen more of that over recent years, actually, if there's a strong core of people saying that this is the right and decent thing to do, then MPs feel happier about speaking out. So that's kind of, you know, them as people. And then the other factor is them as representatives, because they are, you know, a politician is representative of something. No one's quite sure what. There's a big argument about, you know, whether they represent the country, their constituency, the people who voted for them, whatever.
And you can, party, you know, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. But they feel that their job, I mean, their job is to be a representative. And so we need to look at how climate fits with that representative role. And we need to help them make the case that acting on climate is really good for them as a representative. So you can do that by making the sort of co-benefits argument that it's good for jobs or the economy, that it improves people's homes and so on. You can also do it straightforwardly by saying, I'm your constituent and I want you to do stuff about this. The school strikes were very effective about that, because most school strikers met their MPs, and, you know, you've got a bunch of teens who are coming up to voting age saying, you know, this is really important to us. So there's various ways that you can work on that sort of representative function as well.
And do you think there's anything structurally in the sort of democratic system? I saw actually Rory Stewart, who was mentioned in the book briefly, talking about proportional representation is the only way to go, sort of that end to the whip system. Do we need, is that going to be what it takes, or do you think we could get there without a major change?
Well, I mean, you know, I think the first part of the post system is really problematic, not least because politicians in safe seats don't feel that pressure. You know, one of the reasons that Steve Baker can, you know, do what he does in terms of net zero watch and so on is because, you know, he's in a safe seat. But I don't know if people have seen that Steve Baker Watch has been set up, which is exactly his constituents.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
Yeah. So a bunch of his constituents who claim to be cross-party, they're not affiliated. They've set up Steve Baker Watch exactly to put their pressure on him as their representative, which I thought was a canny move. But so I've slightly lost my train of thought there. What was the second bit of?
So the second bit was, do we need something?
Oh, sorry, the electoral reform. Yeah. So yes, I mean, you know, if I could wave a magic wand, I would definitely move to some form of PR, and I would also abolish the House of Lords and put in a second chamber made up of made up through sortition, basically by lottery, just getting normal people to be in the House of Lords.
Oh,
for,
interesting.
I mean, I think it would make a lot of sense. But so I would, if I could wave a magic wand, that's what I would do. But we can't. Do I want to campaign for electoral reform in order to finally get around to tackling climate change better? No.
You're not. No. I just wondered. It was more a wonder. Yeah. Good. Now I will pick up on a couple of things that, because you said companies, and there's a few things. Obviously, there's lobby groups, and I'll now pick up some of the questions. So Kate said fairly early on in the book, you talk about the ways in which the fossil fuel industry influence norms and values across society. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think, the society, so this is a rather grandiose point, but the society that we've built up over, since the Industrial Revolution has been dependent, has depended on fossil fuels. And if you look at, obviously that's the case for our infrastructure. If you look at what powers our factories and our transport systems and so on, but there's also a sort of cultural and even political dimension to that we've grown up in a time of plenty, not well enough distributed, but we've been used to a society with plentiful energy, which allows us to have a lot of choices about the way we live our lives. And I think the extent to which our society has been shaped by fossil fuels is probably overlooked. But then there's an added dimension to that, which is the work of high carbon interests to try and maintain and even extend that sort of fossil fuel status quo. And it's better documented. It's better documented in the US than it is here. I think maybe because it's more obvious what's happened in the US. If you look at the work of Naomi Oreskes and Merchants of Doubt, that kind of thing, it's you can trace the fossil money into politics really easily. I think less work has been done here. Interestingly, it's pretty hard to get funding. There's very little academic work that looks at vested interest because it's not that kind of and so it's mainly done by sort of activist groups. But I mean, it's not at all controversial to say that those companies have had a huge influence, and not just over the political system. If you look at their hold over cultural life, I think one of the best things to happen is a debate about fossil fuel sponsorship of the arts. I mean, it's brilliant. I saw, was it who was it pulled out of BP sponsorship this week? Was it the British Museum?
Was it the RA? No. The Royal Academy? Because they normally are totally BP sponsored.
Yeah, I can't remember which one. There was one that had pulled out this week. So I know the RSC did because of Mark Rylance and others. There's been a succession of them. And so, the Portrait Gallery, someone said.
Oh, well done. Thank you, Laurie.
Because that takes away their license to operate, their cultural license to operate, which is really important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was thinking, and what they could do instead is give a 12th of their excess profits for the year. They could give that as subsidies for energy bills. What's the lowest carbon cocktail? Question. I think it's 6 minutes past 6. That's the perfect question. Lowest carbon cocktail? Any bidders? I think we can open that up to everyone, unless you have an answer, Rebecca.
Well, you see, Kate knows me too well.
There we go.
We've had a bit of a cocktail themed year for one reason or another. But what is the lowest carbon cocktail?
Already,
it would have to be a local one, wouldn't it? I think something with rhubarb and mint, maybe. Rhubarb, mint, and gin. Is that a cocktail? Sequestrini, I love it.
Thanks.
Yeah. The lowest carbon cocktail is definitely the one you make in your own kitchen. Yeah, with the cocktail shaker that you bought from Oxfam, which I actually did.
So I'm still just quite impressed that we're not 2 full months into the year and you've already had a cocktail themed year.
Yeah, well, yeah. It links to significant birthdays.
I'll let you off. So businesses, I guess. A couple of questions have come up on sort of sector specific action, and I'm really interested in how, because we work with business obviously, and I know that there are quite a few big businesses who want to help reset the rules of the game and become, if not quite activist, then at least advocates for change, and how they best do that. And I think my colleague Richard, who's on the call, he's like, I think we should do a study of how the fossil fuel industry in the US has influenced it, so that we can, help copy some of that, but for good, rather than pussyfoot around it. Sorry, Richard, if I'm butchering your sentiment. But how do we do that? We're sort of founding signatories of Business Declares, supporters of the Better Business Act and the CEE, climate emergency and ecology bill, all those things that businesses have signed up for. And yet I'm not seeing any real, it's quite fairly easy to sign up, but I'm also not seeing any effect of those as yet. Do you think, is that the way? Is there a different way that businesses could have a better impact?
I mean, I feel like I should be asking you that question, to be honest. I think, one of the things that's changed fundamentally over the last, say, 10 or 15 years is the voice of progressive business being heard loud and clear. And, we saw that at COP26. I think that, that'll be one of the things that's enabling the UK at the moment to sort of hold firm against the re-emergence of the dinosaurs of the Global Warming Policy Foundation and their new guys. If they didn't have business support, it would be much harder to hold firm against that onslaught. So I think that the voice of progressive business has been, super important. Just one example in all this coal mine stuff I've been doing. I mean, the fact that actually the coal mine, the coal companies want the mine, so the mine is producing metallurgical coal for steel making. Steel companies don't want it. They don't want it because they've all got net zero targets by 2050, and that means long investment cycles. That means change now. Right. And the worst thing that you can do is flood loads of extra coal onto the market. So actually we had the steel companies bizarrely on our side for this. So that's a very tangible example. But one area that I would look at, and I genuinely don't know to what extent, I imagine this is still a huge problem, is that you have progressive businesses being very vocal in public in terms of their support for net zero, but then all kinds of dodgy stuff going on through trade associations. And that I think that still happens, and I think that's really problematic. It's a bit of a, it's straightforward greenwashing, isn't it? If you stand on a very progressive platform, but actually you're members of organisations who do some dodgy lobbying.
No, agreed. Bye, Donna. Thank you for coming. And I loved that Alan Jope from Unilever backed out of several trade associations and said, if they're not in line with our values and purpose, we're gonna move away. No, I completely agree, because it is that thing of the lowest common denominator tends to dominate on that. And I was thinking, because there's only one tiny little thing in the book I take slight issue with. So I thought I'd bring it up now.
Go on.
And this is me I come from, a career in business and innovative companies. And you mentioned sort of, maybe emerging low carbon companies could advise on policy. And I just wanted to flag, for me, that looks really unrealistic. And the reason I mention it is, well, so because small businesses struggle to they're time poor and tend to be overly optimistic about their own technology. So that full picture is missing. But what it made me think of was, could some of those progressive businesses who have the capacity and who do want, to look at a bigger picture or look at a big supply chain, are there new ways that they could engage directly as policy advisors in a different way to what they're doing now? Oh, there's more stuff on steel.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that that it's really, really difficult for companies of the future basically to be lobbying government about, so that they can grow and be part of that solution. But we do have, we have a fundamental structural problem, which is that the companies that have the power and influence and capital now are different, or at least take a different form to the companies that we need to have the power and influence and capital in order to tackle climate change. So, I think your idea of it, being much more maybe much more collaborative across the business community is really important. I also think it, I do think it's up to the companies that that do speak out on this to also, I don't want to say name and shame. I just want to, be absolutely upfront about what needs to be done, and implicitly, and therefore imply what shouldn't be done and what's unacceptable on the part of businesses. Yeah. And the other thing, the other quick thing is that, I mean, businesses have a real problem arguing for legislation, but they need to.
Yeah. No, that there's no other way, right? Oh, and we'll do a follow-up from Paul, just saying, have you seen any true bona fide attempts to pivot or diversify within the steel companies?
Yeah.
Which I guess them supporting the, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, big disclaimer, Paul, I'm not an expert on steel decarbonisation. It's a world I've been sucked into because of the coal mine. But I've worked with a team at Lund University in Sweden, and Sweden, has a big steel industry, and they are probably the furthest forward in terms of in terms of shifting to zero carbon forms of steel making, using, well, obviously, first thing is use less of it, second thing is recycle more, and the third thing is to produce it using green hydrogen. And there are companies who are very committed to that, but their commitment depends on whether they read the runes in terms of what government will do. So, if there's a really strong outcome from the UNFCCC process, they know that they won't be in business unless they do this. So they're really linked, aren't they?
They are so linked. What we found with our little Bankers for Net Zero initiative is that bringing the industry, and we did the retrofit built environment industry in first to talk to the banks about what policies were needed for the banks to give more money. And so being able to play that 3-pod game where industry and finance and politicians kind of can say to each other, well, I need this from you, if we're all going to hold hands and jump together. But still a long way. What is it saying? Oh, David's saying, if we should be hard-edged, then why should businesses hold back on naming and shaming? Isn't that a necessary part of tradition? Yes, I think that's what we said, or Rebecca said, that they should. No,
I held back a bit from the naming and shaming. I mean, to be honest, there are others, including you, Louise, and David, who would have a view on that. I mean, it doesn't happen much. Why doesn't it happen? I don't know. Would it be better, if we so there's lots of celebration of companies who do well. There's not much criticism of the ones who do badly by other businesses. That tends to be sort of NGOs and activists and so on. It's an interesting thought experiment. What if Unilever would start to get would started to publicly name and shame Procter and Gamble or whoever its other big competitors were? I don't know.
Yeah, or maybe instead of even doing it in the competition, doing it through their supply chains, and saying and just being maybe harder edged on, well, we can't work with you if X, Y, and Z, a little bit like they've done with some of the trade associations. But it's hard. I'm seeing a lot of businesses in transition at the moment, and they're the ones who are trying to do well are still not there, of course, and then they put their head above the parapet and are in danger of getting pelted from activists and NGOs and governments on the bits they're not doing well on, even though they're feeling like they're trying to push the but I think that's part of the course in this transition period we're in, which is exciting but also quite scary for everyone.
I had a really heartening conversation with a local company who it's a paper mill just down the road from me in Kendal, and they are just doing everything they can on climate. They've got loads of renewables. They've worked with community energy companies and so on, and they said that there are some products that they have discontinued because of their environmental impact. So they will no longer, so they provide a lot of packaging for other companies basically because they're paper makers, and there are some products which they just think are too just too environmentally damaging, and they just stopped doing them for that reason, which I thought was really impressive.
That is, and that's the thing is figuring that out and having the space and the time to do that. I'm suddenly being aware of time. We have about 12 minutes left, and then you can have supper rather than have
it's all right. I've got the other team making the tea, so I'm it's
you're good.
Yeah.
We'll keep you in here for the gin and tonics, so cocktails, sequestration cocktails. Minu asked a question I just want to grab before. Do you think we're approaching all of the code reds, climate change, COVID, Brexit, etc., as individual issues rather than focusing on how they're connected, and should therefore to some extent be tackled in tandem or all together?
Oh, that's a really tough one. Okay, I'm gonna because we've only got 10 minutes left, I'm gonna say something controversial and everyone can hate me for this. I think there's a tendency on the part of essentially the sort of progressive left, call it that if you want, to turn everything into a sort of systemic crisis of capitalism or democracy or whatever that might be, and see all these links. And like for example, the what people say that you can't have climate, you can't solve climate without social justice, that climate justice has to be the only way forward. And it's probably closest to my own politics. I have I can absolutely see why people link these issues together into a sort of systemic whole, but I think that we need to remember that that is a particular sort of political positioning, and I sometimes don't want to dress it all up as system change. I want to just be quite practical about it, and to be able to ask government to just roll their sleeves up and get on with tackling climate change as a huge issue, without trying to burden it with all the other worries of the world, which then layer up all sorts of different values and outlooks, and unless you buy into the whole thing, then you're not worth talking to. So I mean, that's problematic because the left has a really good story to tell on climate, the climate justice story basically, and the right is a lot more faltering. But I think, a really important job now is to build a really strong sort of right-leaning narrative of climate, because we know that, a lot of people and a lot of people vote right wing, will always have right wing politicians, and they should have a stake in this debate as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important that the way it's gone in the US, I find it's quite worrying that it's become a political issue. Actually, on that note, I'm sure I saw a quick note from a question from Paul saying, can climate responsibility and action work in a dictatorship context? I'm kind of worried about the direction of travel for democracy in general within the US. Oh, the UK. I thought it was the US. Yes. Back to China.
Well, China's the one to watch on that, isn't it? So even in a dictatorship or an autocracy, you need public support unless you achieve sort of, Ceausescu's Romania levels of oppression, and you do it all through oppression. Definitely the case in China, and there's China watchers at Lancaster University who I talk to a lot about this. Definitely in places like China, you need some kind of consent. You need to take people with you, even if they don't get the chance to express that consent at the ballot box. So in China, actually, a lot of their, so I'm told, a lot of their progress on climate has actually come out of air pollution and, wanting to tackle air pollution and smog, and that being a real issue in Chinese cities, and knowing that they'll get the backing of, sort of younger Chinese city dwellers who, see these problems and want action on them. So there's a kind of implicit social contract even in China. So this idea that, the Chinese leaders can just sort of, decree something and that'll happen is not true. They have to listen as well in a different way, but they do have to do that. So I think, there's probably no country, or at least no country with levels of repression that wouldn't be terrible, that could just impose stuff.
No, and I think, I don't know, where I see China also is that sort of geopolitical competition. They really want to be seen as leaders, weirdly. And we had James Thornton from Client Earth here almost a year ago, I think, and he's been over training Chinese Supreme Court judges in climate law and what they should be implementing. So he's quite optimistic about it, but it's fascinating, but it's clearly not, it seems to me clearly that they just want to be the leader and to say they're the leader. But yeah, he was really optimistic about the work he's done in China on that front, weirdly. But can we hope for that democracy stays a little bit solid in the UK and the US? Please. Now, I think we've got time for one more question. Have you got anything you want to ask? We've got this wonderful panel of 35 odd people. If there's anything you want them to do or anything you want to ask them. So I'm putting you on the spot, so you can just say no, actually.
Oh, well, what? I mean, I think the thing I'm most interested in is that, that I want to hear from people on is about the role of business, because it's something I sort of turn over and over in my mind. I sort of feel like I've become more cynical about the ability of the oil majors, for example, to properly change their spots. But I think there's a whole load of companies in the middle, like, the Unilevers and the sort of consumer goods and the manufacturing and so on, who I think aren't, they're not necessarily part of the problem, and how we work with those, I don't, it's not what I'm expert in, and, thoughts on that are always very welcome.
We should definitely talk about that, because I do think that lots of them are interested in how to go. Please, if anybody's got comments on that or suggestions. Yeah, there we go. Hope for the future.
No, this is me saying.
Oh, that's you. There you go. Oh, there you go. I was like, hope for the future. Somebody else come in.
Would you want to? I can give a quick response to Rebecca's last question if you like.
Okay, go for it, David. I know that voice.
Well, I think one of the things here is that transformative innovation rarely comes from incumbents. though the incumbents can scale it once new entrants have come in. So whilst Unilever and so on might be big in FMCG and so on, I would argue that we need entire industrial sectors to change their route basis from linear to circular, from fossil fuel to renewable and so on. And it's unlikely that that's going to be led by, in the first instance, the incumbents. So I think part of working with business is to create a dynamic where the incumbents have to catch up with new entrants, and not to rely on the incumbents to do the heavy lifting in the first instance.
That's interesting. Is that why incumbents often snap up interesting new...
I think that's one of their ways of making sure that they don't get hurt.
They kill them, yeah. And quite often they'll kill them off.
And also historically, when it comes to industrial revolutions, the previous incumbents do not become the incumbents of the next of the next stage of industrial process.
Yeah, well, we're seeing that in the media space, right?
And so I think if we are going to have an industrial revolution against a deadline, which is basically what climate change means, we should not expect the current incumbents to be the incumbents afterwards.
Yep. And and now we're getting other. So Paul Ellingstad, fully agree with the new entrance approach, but the industry-wide approach of Ellen MacArthur Foundation, for circular economics, is having real results of transformation and connecting the two in the space where they can safely work together. Thanks, Lucy. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things we're at least talking about quite a lot, is how to make it safer for them to move faster, because at the moment there doesn't seem to be a lot of advantage in being a first mover on some of these things. You're just increasing your costs or your complexity. Exactly. Paul agrees with me. It's about de-risking it.
And
so,
also, I think, if I can read across from my work with politicians, it's not just de-risking as an organisation; it's de-risking for individuals within those companies. What is going to make you a successful person within that company? Are you able to be successful and speak out and say, we want to do things differently? And it's that sort of, I keep coming back to that sort of almost sociological aspect of it, that we need the best and brightest to be wanting this change.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can see a raised hand from Laurie, so we'll go to Laurie and then we'll end and let everybody get off to dinner or lunch. Laurie.
Hi. I keep on coming back. Businesses need a functioning society, and government provides the infrastructure, the law and the regulations. So I don't understand why business isn't pushing government more in that direction. Businesses alone cannot create the environment they need, or we need as a society. And it gets back to this incumbent issue. Yes, there should be some type of government mechanism support for new technologies to have a chance against the incumbents. Otherwise, the incumbents, buy them up.
I think we could.
And that's on that. How do we? I don't know. Their business's role as part of society is how do it isn't just business, it's actually people on the street as well. How do we wake them up that they just don't have freedoms, they also have a responsibility, Anyhow, that's more of a question. It's
that's a really big question to end on, but a brilliant one. Thank you, Laurie. I am going to call time. I'm just a reminder for everybody to please fill in your survey. We've tried to get it to you now. And I can see that Sophie's promised the next book club book to somebody who fills it out. So go with that. It's going to be another good book club for in March. But for now, thank you, Rebecca. That was brilliant. And we went again so far. And I love your ability to both hold these big thoughts and expansiveness and being really, really pragmatic. Not many people can do that. It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great to talk to you all. And I hope to join you another time.
No, that would be fantastic. And see you in person soon. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining. I can see some people have dropped off already, but
Great.
yeah, thank you. And
Thank you.
Perhaps. Bye.
Bye.